The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 36. In M. Colbert's Carriage. As Gourville had seen, the king's musketeers were mounting and following their captain. The latter, who did not like to be confined in his proceedings, left his brigade under the orders of a lieutenant, and set off on post horses, recommending his men to use all diligence. However rapidly they might travel, they could not arrive before him. He had time, in passing along the Rue des Petits Champs, to see something which afforded him plenty of food for thought and conjecture. He saw M. Colbert coming out from his house to get into his carriage, which was stationed before the door. In this carriage D'Artagnan perceived the hoods of two women, and, being rather curious, he wished to know the names of the ladies hid beneath these hoods. To get a glimpse at them, for they kept themselves closely covered up, he urged his horse so near the carriage that he drove him against the step with such force as to shake everything containing and contained. The terrified women uttered, the one a faint cry, by which D'Artagnan recognized a young woman, the other an imprecation, in which he recognized the vigor and aplomb that half a century bestows. The hoods were thrown back. One of the women was Madame Vanel, the other the Duchesse de Chevreuse. D'Artagnan's eyes were quicker than those of the ladies; he had seen and known them, whilst they did not recognize him. And as they laughed at their fright, pressing each other's hands, "Humph!" said D'Artagnan, "the old duchesse is no more inaccessible to friendship than formerly, she paying her court to the mistress of M. Colbert. Poor M. Fouquet! That presages you nothing good." He rode on. M. Colbert got into his carriage, and the distinguished trio commenced a sufficiently slow pilgrimage toward the wood of Vincennes. Madame de Chevreuse set down Madame Vanel at her husband's house, and, left alone with M. Colbert, chatted upon affairs whilst continuing her ride. She had an inexhaustible fund of conversation, that dear duchesse, and as she always talked for the ill of others, though ever with a view to her own good, her conversation amused her interlocutor, and did not fail to leave a favorable impression. She taught Colbert, who, poor man, was ignorant of the fact, how great a minister he was, and how Fouquet would soon become a cipher. She promised to rally around him, when he should become surintendant, all the old nobility of the kingdom, and question him as to the preponderance it would be proper to allow La Valliere. She praised him, she blamed him, she bewildered him. She showed him the secret of so many secrets, that for a moment Colbert thought he was doing business with the devil. She proved to him that she held in her hand the Colbert of today, as she had held the Fouquet of yesterday, and as he asked her very simply the reason of her hatred for the surintendant, "Why do you yourself hate him?" said she. "Madame, in politics," replied he, "the differences of system oft bring about dissensions between men. Monsieur Fouquet always appeared to me to practice a system opposed to the true interests of the king." She interrupted him. "I will say no more to you about Monsieur Fouquet. The journey the king is about to take to Nantes will give a good account of him. Monsieur Fouquet, for me, is a man gone by, and for you also." Colbert made no reply. "On his return from Nantes," continued the duchesse, "the king, who is only anxious for a pretext, will find the states have not behaved well, that they have made too few sacrifices. The states will say that the imposts are too heavy, and that the surintendant has ruined them. The king will lay all the blame on M. Fouquet, and then—" "And then?" said Colbert. "Oh, he will be disgraced. Is not that your opinion?" Colbert darted a glance at the duchesse, which plainly said, "If M. Fouquet be only disgraced, you will not be the cause of it." "Your place, M. Colbert," the duchesse hastened to add, "must be a high place." Do you perceive any one between the king and yourself after the fall of M. Fouquet?" "I do not understand," said he. "You will understand. To what does your ambition aspire?" "I have none." "It was useless, then, to overthrow the superintendent, M. Colbert. It was idle." "I had the honor to tell you, madame oh, yes, I know all about the interest of the king; but, if you please, we will speak of your own." "Mine, that is to say, the affairs of his majesty." "In short, are you, or are you not endeavoring to ruin M. Fouquet? Answer without evasion." "Madame, I ruin nobody." "I am endeavoring to comprehend, then, why you purchased from me the letters of M. Mazarin concerning M. Fouquet. Neither can I conceive why you have laid those letters before the king." Colbert, half stupefied, looked at the duchesse with an air of constraint. "Madame," said he, "I can less easily conceive how you, who received the money, can reproach me on that head." "That is," said the old duchesse, "because we must will that which we wish for, unless we are not able to obtain what we wish." "Will?" said Colbert, quite confounded by such coarse logic. "You are not able. Hein! Speak." "I am not able, I allow, to destroy certain influences near the king." "That fight in favor of M. Fouquet? What are they? Stop, let me help you." "Do, madame." "La Valliere?" "Oh! very little influence, no knowledge of business, and small means. M. Fouquet has paid his court to her." "To defend him would be to accuse herself, would it not?" "I think it would." "There is still another influence. What do you say to that?" "Is it considerable?" "The queen mother, perhaps." "Her majesty the queen mother has a weakness for M. Fouquet very prejudicial to her son." "Never believe that," said the old duchesse, smiling. "Oh!" said Colbert, with incredulity, "I have often experienced it." "Formerly?" "Very recently, madame, at Vaux. It was she who prevented the king from having M. Fouquet arrested." "People do not forever entertain the same opinions, my dear monsieur. That which the queen may have wished recently she would not wish, perhaps, to day." "And why not?" said Colbert, astonished. "Oh, the reason is of very little consequence." "On the contrary, I think it is of great consequence; for, if I were certain of not displeasing her majesty, the queen mother, my scruples would be all removed." "Well, have you never heard talk of a certain secret?" "A secret?" "Call it what you like. In short, the queen mother has conceived a bitter hatred for all those who have participated, in one fashion or another, in the discovery of this secret, and M. Fouquet, I believe, is one of these." "Then," said Colbert, "we may be sure of the assent of the queen mother?" "I have just left her majesty, and she assures me so." "So be it, then, madame." "But there is something further. Do you happen to know a man who was the intimate friend of M. Fouquet, M. d'Herblay, a bishop, I believe?" "Bishop of Vannes." "Well, this M. d'Herblay, who also knew the secret, the queen mother is pursuing with the utmost rancor." "Indeed!" "So hotly pursued, that if he were dead, she would not be satisfied with anything less than his head; to satisfy her he would never speak again." "And is that the desire of the queen mother?" "An order is given for it." "This M. d'Herblay shall be sought for, madame." Oh, it is well known where he is. Colbert looked at the duchesse. Say where, madame. He is at Belle Ile en Mer. At the residence of Monsieur Fouquet? At the residence of Monsieur Fouquet. He shall be taken. It was now the duchesse's turn to smile. Do not fancy the capture so easy, said she. Do not promise it so lightly. Why not, madame? Because Monsieur d'Herblay is not one of those people who can be taken when and where you please. He is a rebel, then? Oh, Monsieur Colbert, we have passed all our lives in making rebels, and yet you see plainly that so far from being taken, we take others. Colbert fixed upon the old duchesse one of those fierce looks of which no words can convey the expression, accompanied by a firmness not altogether wanting in grandeur. The times are gone, said he, in which subjects gain duchies by making war against the king of France. If Monsieur d'Herblay conspires, he will perish on the scaffold. That will give, or will not give, pleasure to his enemies, a matter, by the way, of little importance to us. And this us, a strange word in the mouth of Colbert, made the duchesse thoughtful for a moment. She caught herself reckoning inwardly with this man. Colbert had regained his superiority in the conversation, and he meant to keep it. You ask me, madame, he said, to have this Monsieur d'Herblay arrested? I asked nothing of the kind. I thought you did, madame. But, as I have been mistaken, we will leave him alone. The king has said nothing about him. The duchesse bit her nails. Besides, continued Colbert, what a poor capture would this bishop be? A bishop game for a king? Oh, no, no, I will not even take the slightest notice of him. The hatred of the duchesse now discovered itself. Game for a woman, said she. Is not the queen a woman? If she wishes Monsieur d'Herblay arrested, she has her reasons. Besides, is not Monsieur d'Herblay the friend of him who is doomed to fall? Oh, never mind that, said Colbert. This man shall be spared if he is not the enemy of the king. Is that displeasing to you? I say nothing. Yes, you wish to see him in prison, in the Bastille, for instance. I believe a secret better concealed behind the walls of the Bastille than behind those of Belle Ile. I will speak to the king about it. He will clear up the point. And whilst waiting for that enlightenment, Monsieur l'Evêque de Vannes will have escaped. I would do so. Escaped? He? And whither should he escape? Europe is ours, in will if not in fact. He will always find an asylum, monsieur. It is evident you know nothing of the man you have to do with. You do not know d'Herblay, you do not know Aramis. He was one of those 4 musketeers who, under the late king, made Cardinal de Richelieu tremble, and who, during the regency, gave so much trouble to Monseigneur Mazarin. But, madame, what can he do, unless he has a kingdom to back him? He has one, monsieur. A kingdom, he? What? Monsieur d'Herblay? I repeat to you, monsieur, that if he wants a kingdom, he either has it or will have it. Well, as you are so earnest that this rebel should not escape, madame, I promise you he shall not escape. Belle Ile is fortified, Monsieur Colbert, and fortified by him. If Belle Ile were also defended by him, Belle Ile is not impregnable, and if Monsieur l'Evêque de Vannes is shut up in Belle Ile, well, madame, the place shall be besieged, and he will be taken. You may be very certain, monsieur, that the zeal you display in the interest of the queen mother will please her majesty mightily, and you will be magnificently rewarded. But what shall I tell her of your projects respecting this man?" "That when once taken, he shall be shut up in a fortress from which her secret shall never escape." "Very well, Monsieur Colbert, and we may say that, dating from this instant, we have formed a solid alliance, that is, you and I, and that I am absolutely at your service." "It is I, madame, who place myself at yours. This Chevalier d'Herblay is a kind of Spanish spy, is he not?" "Much more." "A secret ambassador?" "Higher still." "Stop! King Philip III. of Spain is a bigot. He is, perhaps, the confessor of Philip III." "You must go higher, even than that." "Mordioux!" cried Colbert, who forgot himself so far as to swear in the presence of this great lady, of this old friend of the queen mother. "He must then be the general of the Jesuits." "I believe you have guessed it at last," replied the duchesse. "Ah, then, madame, this man will ruin us all if we do not ruin him, and we must make haste, too." "Such was my opinion, monsieur, but I did not dare to give it you." "And it was lucky for us he has attacked the throne, and not us." "But, mark this well, Monsieur Colbert, Monsieur d'Herblay is never discouraged. If he has missed one blow, he will be sure to make another. He will begin again. If he has allowed an opportunity to escape of making a king for himself, sooner or later he will make another, of whom to a certainty you will not be prime minister." Colbert knitted his brow with a menacing expression. "I feel assured that a prison will settle this affair for us, madame, in a manner satisfactory for both." The duchesse smiled again. "Oh, if you knew," said she, "how many times Aramis has got out of prison!" "Oh!" replied Colbert, "we will take care that he shall not get out this time." "But you were not attending to what I said to you just now. Do you remember that Aramis was one of the four invincibles whom Richelieu so dreaded? And at that period the four musketeers were not in possession of that which they have now, money and experience." Colbert bit his lips. "We will now renounce the idea of the prison," said he, in a lower tone. "We will find a little retreat from which the invincible cannot possibly escape." "That was well spoken, our ally," replied the duchesse. "But it is getting late. Had we not better return?" "The more willingly, madame, for my having my preparations to make for setting out with the king." "To Paris!" cried the duchesse to the coachman. And the carriage returned towards the Faubourg Saint Antoine, after the conclusion of the treaty that gave to death the last friend of Fouquet, the last defender of Belle Isle, the former friend of Marie Michon, the new foe of the old duchesse. End of chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 37. The Two Lighters. D'Artagnan had set off. Fouquet likewise was gone, and with a rapidity which doubled the tender interests of his friends. The first moments of this journey, or better say, this flight, were troubled by a ceaseless dread of every horse and carriage to be seen behind the fugitive. It was not natural, in fact, if Louis XIV. Was determined to seize this prey, that he should allow it to escape. The young lion was already accustomed to the chase, and he had bloodhounds sufficiently clever to be trusted. But insensibly all fears were dispersed. The surintendant, by hard traveling, placed such a distance between himself and his persecutors, that no one of them could reasonably be expected to overtake him. As to his position, his friends had made it excellent for him. Was he not traveling to join the king at Nantes? And what did the rapidity prove but his zeal to obey? He arrived, fatigued but reassured, at Orleans, where he found, thanks to the care of a courier who had preceded him, a handsome lighter of 8 oars. These lighters, in the shape of gondolas, somewhat wide and heavy, containing a small chamber covered by the deck, and a chamber in the poop formed by a tent, then acted as passage boats from Orleans to Nantes, by the Loire, and this passage, a long one in our days, appeared then more easy and convenient than the high road, with its post hacks and its ill hung carriages. Fouquet went on board this lighter, which set out immediately. The rowers, knowing they had the honor of conveying the surintendant of the finances, pulled with all their strength, and that magic word, the finances, promised them a liberal gratification, of which they wished to prove themselves worthy. The lighter seemed to leap the waves of the Loire. Magnificent weather, a sunrise that empurpled all the landscape, displayed the river in all its limpid serenity. The current and the rowers carried Fouquet along as wings carry a bird, and he arrived before Beaugency without the slightest accident having signalized the voyage. Fouquet hoped to be the first to arrive at Nantes. There he would see the notables and gain support among the principal members of the States. He would make himself a necessity, a thing very easy for a man of his merit, and would delay the catastrophe, if he did not succeed in avoiding it entirely. "Besides," said Gourville to him, "at Nantes you will make out, or we will make out, the intentions of your enemies. We will have horses always ready to convey you to Poitou, a bark in which to gain the sea, and when once upon the open sea, Belle Isle is your inviolable port. You see, besides, that no one is watching you, no one is following." He had scarcely finished when they discovered at a distance, behind an elbow formed by the river, the mast of a huge lighter coming down. The rowers of Fouquet's boat uttered a cry of surprise on seeing this galley. "What is the matter?" asked Fouquet. "The matter is, monseigneur," replied the patron of the bark, "that it is a truly remarkable thing. That lighter comes along like a hurricane." Gourville started, and mounted to the deck, in order to obtain a better view. Fouquet did not go up with him, but said to Gourville, with restrained mistrust, "See what it is, dear friend." The lighter had just passed the elbow. It came on so fast, that behind it might be plainly seen the white wake illumined with the fires of the day. "How they go!" repeated the skipper. "How they go! They must be well paid. I do not think," he added, "that oars of wood could behave better than ours, but yonder oarsmen prove the contrary." "Well they may," said one of the rowers. "They are 12, and we but 8." "12 rowers," replied Gourville. 12! Impossible!" The number of 8 rowers for a lighter had never been exceeded, even for the king. This honor had been paid to monsieur le surintendant more for the sake of haste than of respect. "What does it mean?" said Gourville, endeavoring to distinguish beneath the tent, which was already apparent, travelers which the most piercing eye could not yet have succeeded in discovering. "They must be in a hurry, for it is not the king," said the patron. Fouquet shuddered. "By what sign do you know that it is not the king?" said Gourville. "In the first place, because there is no white flag with fleur de lis, which the royal lighter always carries." "And then," said Fouquet, "because it is impossible it should be the king, Gourville, as the king was still in Paris yesterday." Gourville replied to the surintendant by a look which said, "You were there yourself yesterday." "And by what sign do you make out they are in such haste?" added he, for the sake of gaining time. "By this, monsieur," said the patron. "These people must have set out a long while after us, and they have already nearly overtaken us." "Bah!" said Gourville, "who told you that they do not come from Beaugency, or from Moix even?" "We have seen no lighter of that shape except at Orleans. It comes from Orleans, monsieur, and makes great haste." Fouquet and Gourville exchanged a glance. The captain remarked their uneasiness, and, to mislead him, Gourville immediately said, "Some friend who has laid a wager he would catch us. Let us win the wager, and not allow him to come up with us." The patron opened his mouth to say that it was quite impossible, but Fouquet said with much hauteur, "If it is any one who wishes to overtake us, let him come." "We can try, monseigneur," said the man timidly. "Come, you fellows, put out your strength. Row, row!" "No," said Fouquet. "On the contrary, stop short." "Monseigneur, what folly!" interrupted Gourville, stooping towards his ear. "Pull up!" repeated Fouquet. The 8 oars stopped, and, resisting the water, created a retrograde motion. It stopped. The 12 rowers and the other did not at first perceive this maneuver, for they continued to urge on their boat so vigorously that it arrived quickly within musket shot. Fouquet was short-sighted, Gourville was annoyed by the sun, now full in his eyes. The skipper alone, with that habit and clearness which are acquired by a constant struggle with the elements, perceived distinctly the travelers in the neighboring lighter. "I can see them!" cried he. "There are 2." "I can see nothing," said Gourville. "You will not be long before you distinguish them. In 20 strokes of their oars they will be within 10 paces of us." But what the patron announced was not realized. The lighter imitated the movement commanded by Fouquet, and instead of coming to join its pretended friends, it stopped short in the middle of the river. "I cannot comprehend this," said the captain. "Nor I!" cried Gourville. "You who can see so plainly the people in that lighter," resumed Fouquet, "try to describe them to us before we are too far off." "I thought I saw 2," replied the boatman. "I can only see one now, under the tent." "What sort of man is he?" "He is a dark man, broad-shouldered, bull-necked." A little cloud at that moment passed across the azure, darkening the sun. Gourville, who was still looking, with one hand over his eyes, became able to see what he sought, and all at once, jumping from the deck into the chamber where Fouquet awaited him, "Colbert!" said he, in a voice broken by emotion. "Colbert!" repeated Fouquet. "Too strange! But no, it is impossible." "I tell you I recognized him, and he at the same time so plainly recognized me that he is just gone into the chamber on the poop. Perhaps the king has sent him on our track." "In that case he would join us, instead of lying by. What is he doing there?" "He is watching us, without a doubt." "I do not like uncertainty," said Fouquet. "Let us go straight up to him." "Oh, monseigneur, do not do that. The lighter is full of armed men." "He wishes to arrest me, then, Gourville? Why does he not come on?" "Monseigneur, it is not consistent with your dignity to go over to meet even your ruin." "But to allow them to watch me like a malefactor!" "Nothing yet proves that they are watching you, monseigneur. Be patient." "What is to be done, then?" "Do not stop. You are only going so fast to appear to obey the king's order with zeal. Redouble the speed. He who lives will see." "That is better. Come!" cried Fouquet. "Since they remain stock still yonder, let us go on." The captain gave the signal, and Fouquet's rowers resumed their task with all the success that could be looked for from men who had rested. Scarcely had the lighter made 100 fathoms, than the other, that with the 12 rowers, resumed its rapid course. This position lasted all day, without any increase or diminution of distance between the 2 vessels. Towards evening Fouquet wished to try the intentions of his persecutor. He ordered his rowers to pull towards the shore, as if to effect a landing. Colbert's lighter imitated this maneuver and steered towards the shore in a slanting direction. By the merest chance, at the spot where Fouquet pretended to wish to land, a stableman from the chateau of Langeais, was following the flowery banks, leading 3 horses in halters. Without doubt, the people of the 12-oared lighter fancied that Fouquet was directing his course to these horses ready for flight, for 4 or 5 men, armed with muskets, jumped from the lighter on to the shore and marched along the banks, as if to gain ground on the horsemen. Fouquet, satisfied of having forced the enemy to a demonstration, considered his intention evident, and put his boat in motion again. Colbert's people returned likewise to theirs, and the course of the 2 vessels was resumed with fresh perseverance. Upon seeing this, Fouquet felt himself threatened closely, and in a prophetic voice, "Well, Gourville," said he, whisperingly, "what did I say at our last repast, at my house? Am I going, or not, to my ruin?" "Oh, monseigneur!" "These 2 boats, which follow each other with so much emulation, as if we were disputing, Monsieur Colbert and I, a prize for swiftness on the Loire, do they not aptly represent our fortunes? And do you not believe, Gourville, that one of the 2 will be wrecked at Nantes?" "At least," objected Gourville, "there is still uncertainty. You are about to appear at the States. You are about to show what sort of man you are. Your eloquence and genius for business are the buckler and sword that will serve to defend you, if not to conquer with. The Bretons do not know you, and when they become acquainted with you, your cause is won. Oh, let Monsieur Colbert look to it well, for his lighter is as much exposed as yours to being upset. Both go quickly, his faster than yours, it is true. We shall see which will be wrecked first." Fouquet, taking Gourville's hand, "My friend," said he, "everything considered, remember the proverb, 'First come, first served.' Well, Monsieur Colbert cares not to pass me. He is a prudent man, is Monsieur Colbert." He was right. The 2 lighters held their course as far as Nantes, watching each other. When the surintendant landed, Gourville hoped he should be able to seek refuge at once, and have the relays prepared. But, at the landing, the 2nd lighter joined the first, and Colbert, approaching Fouquet, saluted him on the quay with marks of the profoundest respect, marks so significant, so public, that their result was the bringing of the whole population upon La Fosse. Fouquet was completely self-possessed. He felt that in his last moments of greatness he had obligations toward himself. He wished to fall from such a height that his fall should crush some of his enemies. Colbert was there, so much the worse for Colbert. The surintendant, therefore, coming up to him, replied, with that arrogant semi-closure of the eyes peculiar to him, "What, is that you, Monsieur Colbert?" "To offer you my respects, monseigneur," said the latter. "Were you in that lighter?" pointing to the one with 12 rowers. "Yes, monseigneur." "Of 12 rowers?" said Fouquet. "What luxury, Monsieur Colbert! For a moment I thought it was the queen mother." "Monseigneur!" and Colbert blushed. "This is a voyage that will cost those who have to pay for it dear, Monsieur l'Intendant," said Fouquet. "But you have, happily, arrived. You see, however," added he, a moment after, "that I, who had but 8 rowers, arrived before you." And he turned his back towards him, leaving him uncertain whether the maneuvers of the 2nd lighter had escaped the notice of the first. At least he did not give him the satisfaction of showing that he had been frightened. Colbert, so annoyingly attacked, did not give way. "I have not been quick, monseigneur, because I followed your example whenever you stopped." "And why did you do that, Monsieur Colbert?" cried Fouquet, irritated by the base audacity. "As you had a superior crew to mine, why did you not either join me or pass me?" "Out of respect," said the intendant, bowing to the ground. Fouquet got into a carriage which the city had sent to him, we know not why or how, and he repaired to La Maison de Nantes, escorted by a vast crowd of people, who for several days had been agog with expectation of a convocation of the States. Scarcely was he installed when Gourville went out to order horses on the route to Poitiers and Vannes, and a boat at Paimboeuf. He performed these various operations with so much mystery, activity, and generosity, that never was Fouquet, then laboring under an attack of fever, more nearly saved, except for the counteraction of that immense disturber of human projects, chance. A report was spread during the night that the king was coming in great haste on post horses, and would arrive in 10 or 12 hours at the latest. The people, while waiting for the king, were greatly rejoiced to see the musketeers, newly arrived, with Monsieur d'Artagnan, their captain, and quartered in the castle, of which they occupied all the posts, in quality of guard of honor. Monsieur d'Artagnan, who was very polite, presented himself, about 10 o'clock, at the lodgings of the surintendant to pay his respectful compliments. And although the minister suffered from fever, although he was in such pain as to be bathed in sweat, he would receive Monsieur d'Artagnan, who was delighted with that honor, as will be seen by the conversation they had together. End of chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 38. Friendly Advice. Fouquet had gone to bed, like a man who clings to life and wishes to economize, as much as possible, that slender tissue of existence, of which the shocks and frictions of this world so quickly wear out the tenuity. D'Artagnan appeared at the door of this chamber, and was saluted by the superintendent with a very affable "Good day." "Bonjour, monseigneur," replied the musketeer. "How did you get through the journey?"
"Tolerably well, thank you."
"And the fever?"
"But poorly. I drink, as you perceive. I am scarcely arrived, and I have already levied a contribution of tisane upon nuts."
"You should sleep first, monseigneur."
"Eh, corbleu! My dear Monsieur d'Artagnan, I should be very glad to sleep."
"Who hinders you?"
"Why, you, in the first place."
"I? Oh, monseigneur!"
"No doubt you do. Is it not as at Paris? Do you not come in the king's name?"
"For heaven's sake, monseigneur," replied the captain, "leave the king alone. The day on which I shall come on the part of the king, for the purpose you mean, take my word for it, I will not leave you long in doubt. You will see me place my hand on my sword, according to the ordonnance, and you will hear my say at once, in ceremonial voice, 'Monseigneur, in the name of the king, I arrest you.'"
"You promise me that frankness?"
said the superintendent. "Upon my honor. But we have not come to that, believe me."
"What makes you think that, Monsieur d'Artagnan? For my part, I think quite the contrary."
"I have heard speak of nothing of the kind," replied D'Artagnan.
"Eh, eh?"
said Fouquet. "Indeed, no. You are an agreeable man, in spite of your fever. The king should not, cannot help loving you at the bottom of his heart." Fouquet's expression implied doubt.
"But Monsieur Colbert," said he, "does Monsieur Colbert love me as much as you say?"
"I am not speaking of Monsieur Colbert," replied D'Artagnan. "He is an exceptional man. He does not love you; so much is very possible; but, mordioux, the squirrel can guard himself against the adder with very little trouble."
"Do you know that you are speaking to me quite as a friend?" replied Fouquet, "and that, upon my life, I have never met with a man of your intelligence and heart?"
"You are pleased to say so," replied D'Artagnan. "Why did you wait till to day to pay me such a compliment?"
"Blind that we are!"
murmured Fouquet. "Your voice is getting hoarse," said D'Artagnan. "Drink, monseigneur, drink!" And he offered him a cup of tisane, with the most friendly cordiality. Fouquet took it, and thanked him by a gentle smile. Such things only happen to me, said the musketeer. I have passed 10 years under your very beard, while you were rolling about tons of gold. You were clearing an annual pension of 4 millions. You never observed me, and you find out there is such a person in the world just at the moment I am about to fall," interrupted Fouquet. "That is true, my dear Monsieur d'Artagnan." "I did not say so." "But you thought so, and that is the same thing. Well, if I fall, take my word as truth, I shall not pass a single day without saying to myself, as I strike my brow, 'Fool, fool, stupid mortal! You had a Monsieur d'Artagnan under your eye and hand, and you did not employ him, you did not enrich him.'" "You overwhelm me," said the captain. "I esteem you greatly." "There exists another man, then, who does not think as M. Colbert thinks," said the surintendant. "How this M. Colbert looms up in your imagination! He is worse than fever." "Oh, I have good cause," said Fouquet. "Judge for yourself." And he related the details of the course of the lighters, and the hypocritical persecution of Colbert. "Is not this a clear sign of my ruin?" D'Artagnan became very serious. "That is true," he said. "Yes, it has an unsavory odor, as M. de Treville used to say." And he fixed on M. Fouquet his intelligent and significant look. "Am I not clearly designated in that, captain? Is not the king bringing me to Nantes to get me away from Paris, where I have so many creatures, and to possess himself of Belle Isle?" "Where M. d'Herblay is," added D'Artagnan. Fouquet raised his head. "As for me, monseigneur," continued D'Artagnan, "I can assure you the king has said nothing to me against you." "Indeed?" "The king commanded me to set out for Nantes, it is true, and to say nothing about it to M. de Gesvres." "My friend." "To M. de Gesvres, yes, monseigneur," continued the musketeer, whose eyes did not cease to speak a language different from the language of his lips. "The king, moreover, commanded me to take a brigade of musketeers, which is apparently superfluous, as the country is quite quiet." "A brigade!" said Fouquet, raising himself upon his elbow. 96 horsemen; yes, monseigneur, the same number as were employed in arresting Messieurs de Chalais, de Cinq Mars, and Montmorency." Fouquet pricked up his ears at these words, pronounced without apparent value. "And what else?" said he. "Oh, nothing but insignificant orders, such as guarding the castle, guarding every lodging, allowing none of M. de Gesvres' guards to occupy a single post." "And as to myself," cried Fouquet, "what orders had you?" "As to you, monseigneur, not the smallest word."
"Monsieur d'Artagnan, my safety, my honor, perhaps my life are at stake. You would not deceive me?"
"I? To what end? Are you threatened? Only there really is an order with respect to carriages and boats." "An order?" "Yes, but it cannot concern you; a simple measure of police." "What is it, captain? What is it?" "To forbid all horses or boats to leave Nantes without a pass signed by the king." "Great God! But—" D'Artagnan began to laugh. "All that is not to be put into execution before the arrival of the king at Nantes. So that you see plainly, monseigneur, the order in no wise concerns you." Fouquet became thoughtful, and D'Artagnan feigned not to observe his preoccupation. "It is evident, by my thus confiding to you the orders which have been given to me, that I am friendly towards you, and that I am trying to prove to you that none of them are directed against you." "Without doubt, without doubt," said Fouquet, still absent. "Let us recapitulate," said the captain, his glance beaming with earnestness.
a special guard about the castle in which your lodging is to be, is it not? Do you know the castle? Ah, monseigneur, a regular prison. The absence of M. de Gesvres, which has the honor of being one of your friends. The closing of the gates of the city, and of the river without a pass, but only when the king shall have arrived. Please to observe, Monsieur Fouquet, that if, instead of speaking to a man like you, who are one of the first in the kingdom, I were speaking to a troubled, uneasy conscience, I should compromise myself forever. What a fine opportunity for any one who wished to be free! No police, no guards, no orders, the water free, the roads free, Monsieur d'Artagnan obliged to lend his horses if required. All this ought to reassure you, Monsieur Fouquet, for the king would not have left me thus independent if he had any sinister designs. In truth, Monsieur Fouquet, ask me whatever you like, I am at your service, and in return, if you will consent to do it, do me a service, that of giving my compliments to Aramis and Porthos, in case you embark for Belle Isle, as you have a right to do without changing your dress, immediately, in your robe de chambre, just as you are." Saying these words, and with a profound bow, the musketeer, whose looks had lost none of their intelligent kindness, left the apartment. He had not reached the steps of the vestibule, when Fouquet, quite beside himself, hung to the bell rope, and shouted, "My horses! My lighter!" But nobody answered. The surintendant dressed himself with everything that came to hand. "Gourville! Gourville!" cried he, while slipping his watch into his pocket; and the bell sounded again, whilst Fouquet repeated, "Gourville! Gourville!" Gourville at length appeared, breathless and pale. "Let us be gone! Let us be gone!" cried Fouquet, as soon as he saw him. "It is too late," said the surintendant's poor friend. "Too late? Why?" "Listen!" And they heard the sounds of trumpets and drums in front of the castle. "What does that mean, Gourville?" "It means the king is come, monseigneur." "The king!" "The king, who has ridden double stages, who has killed horses, and who is 8 hours in advance of all our calculations." "We are lost," murmured Fouquet. "Brave D'Artagnan, all is over. Thou hast spoken to me too late." The king, in fact, was entering the city, which soon resounded with the cannon from the ramparts, and from a vessel which replied from the lower parts of the river. Fouquet's brow darkened; he called his valet de chambre and dressed in ceremonial costume. From his window, behind the curtains, he could see the eagerness of the people, and the movement of a large troop, which had followed the prince. The king was conducted to the castle with great pomp, and Fouquet saw him dismount under the portcullis, and say something in the ear of D'Artagnan, who held his stirrup. D'Artagnan, when the king had passed under the arch, directed his steps towards the house Fouquet was in, but so slowly, and stopping so frequently to speak to his musketeers, drawn up like a hedge, that it might be said he was counting the seconds, or the steps, before accomplishing his object. Fouquet opened the window to speak to him in the court. "Ah!" cried D'Artagnan, on perceiving him, "are you still there, monseigneur?" And that word still completed the proof to Fouquet of how much information and how many useful counsels were contained in the first visit the musketeer had paid him. The surintendant sighed deeply. "Good heavens! Yes, monsieur," replied he. "The arrival of the king has interrupted me in the projects I had formed." "Oh! then you know that the king has arrived?" "Yes, monsieur. I have seen him, and this time you come from him." "To inquire after you, monseigneur, and, if your health is not too bad, to beg you to have the kindness to repair to the castle." "Directly, Monsieur d'Artagnan, directly." "Ah, mordioux!" said the captain. "Now the king is come, there is no more walking for anybody.
No more free will. The password governs all now, you as much as me as much as you." Fouquet heaved a last sigh, climbed with difficulty into his carriage, so great was his weakness, and went to the castle, escorted by D'Artagnan, whose politeness was not less terrifying this time than it had just before been consoling and cheerful. End of chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 39. How the King, Louis XIV, played his little part. As Fouquet was alighting from his carriage, to enter the castle of Nantes, a man of mean appearance went up to him with marks of the greatest respect, and gave him a letter. D'Artagnan endeavored to prevent this man from speaking to Fouquet, and pushed him away, but the message had been given to the surintendant. Fouquet opened the letter and read it, and instantly a vague terror, which D'Artagnan did not fail to penetrate, was painted on the countenance of the first minister. Fouquet put the paper into the portfolio which he had under his arm, and passed on towards the king's apartments. D'Artagnan, through the small windows made at every landing of the donjon stairs, saw, as he went up behind Fouquet, the man who had delivered the note, looking round him on the place and making signs to several persons, who disappeared in the adjacent streets, after having themselves repeated the signals. Fouquet was made to wait for a moment on the terrace of which we have spoken, a terrace which abutted on the little corridor, at the end of which the cabinet of the king was located. Here D'Artagnan passed on before the surintendant, whom till that time he had respectfully accompanied, and entered the royal cabinet. "Well?" asked Louis XIV, who, on perceiving him, threw on to the table covered with papers a large green cloth. "The order is executed, sire." "And Fouquet?" "Monsieur le surintendant follows me," said D'Artagnan. "In 10 minutes let him be introduced," said the king, dismissing D'Artagnan again with a gesture. The latter retired, but had scarcely reached the corridor at the extremity of which Fouquet was waiting for him, when he was recalled by the king's bell. "Did he not appear astonished?" asked the king. "Who, sire?" "Fouquet," replied the king, without saying a monsieur, a peculiarity which confirmed the captain of the musketeers in his suspicions. "No, sire," replied he. "That's well." And a second time Louis dismissed D'Artagnan. Fouquet had not quitted the terrace where he had been left by his guide. He reperused his note, conceived thus: "Something is being contrived against you. Perhaps they will not dare to carry it out at the castle; it will be on your return home. The house is already surrounded by musketeers. Do not enter. A white horse is in waiting for you behind the esplanade." Fouquet recognized the writing and zeal of Gourville. Not being willing that, if any evil happened to himself, this paper should compromise a faithful friend, the surintendant was busy tearing it into 1,000 morsels, spread about by the wind from the balustrade of the terrace. D'Artagnan found him watching the snowflake fluttering of the last scraps in space. "Monsieur," said he, "the king awaits you." Fouquet walked with a deliberate step along the little corridor, where Messieurs de Brienne and Rose were at work, whilst the Duc de Saint Aignan, seated on a chair, likewise in the corridor, appeared to be waiting for orders, with feverish impatience, his sword between his legs. It appeared strange to Fouquet that Messieurs Brienne, Rose, and de Saint Aignan, in general so attentive and obsequious, should scarcely take the least notice, as he, the surintendant, passed. But how could he expect to find it otherwise among courtiers, he whom the king no longer called anything but Fouquet? He raised his head, determined to look every one and everything bravely in the face, and entered the king's apartment, where a little bell, which we already know, had already announced him to his majesty. The king, without rising, nodded to him, and with interest. "Well, how are you, Monsieur Fouquet?" said he. "I am in a high fever," replied the surintendant, "but I am at the king's service." "That is well. the states assemble tomorrow. Have you a speech ready?" Fouquet looked at the king with astonishment. "I have not, sire," replied he, "but I will improvise one. I am too well acquainted with affairs to feel any embarrassment. I have only one question to ask. Will your majesty permit me?" "Certainly, ask it." "Why did not your majesty do his first minister the honor of giving him notice of this in Paris?" "You were ill; I was not willing to fatigue you." "Never did an explanation fatigue me, sire; and since the moment is come for me to demand an explanation of my king—" "Oh, Monsieur Fouquet, an explanation? An explanation, pray, of what?" "Of your majesty's intentions with respect to myself." The king blushed. "I have been calumniated," continued Fouquet, warmly, "and I feel called upon to adjure the justice of the king to make inquiries." "You say all this to me very uselessly, Monsieur Fouquet. I know what I know." "Your majesty can only know the things that have been told to you, and I, on my part, have said nothing to you, whilst others have spoken many, many times." "What do you wish to say?" said the king, impatient to put an end to this embarrassing conversation. "I will go straight to the facts, sire, and I accuse a certain man of having injured me in your majesty's opinion." "Nobody has injured you, Monsieur Fouquet." "That reply proves to me, sire, that I am right." "Monsieur Fouquet, I do not like people to be accused." "Not when one is accused?" "We have already spoken too much about this affair." "Your majesty will not allow me to justify myself?" "I repeat that I do not accuse you." Fouquet, with a half bow, made a step backward. "It is certain," thought he, "that he has made up his mind. He alone who cannot go back can show such obstinacy. Not to see the danger now would be to be blind indeed; not to shun it would be stupid." He resumed aloud: "Did your majesty send for me on business?" "No, Monsieur Fouquet, but for some advice I wish to give you." "I respectfully await it, sire." "Rest yourself, Monsieur Fouquet. Do not throw away your strength. The session of the states will be short, and when my secretaries shall have closed it, I do not wish business to be talked of in France for a fortnight." "Has the king nothing to say to me on the subject of this assembly of the states?" "No, Monsieur Fouquet." "Not to me, the surintendant of the finances?" "Rest yourself, I beg you; that is all I have to say to you." Fouquet bit his lips and hung his head. He was evidently busy with some uneasy thought. This uneasiness struck the king. "Are you angry at having to rest yourself, Monsieur Fouquet?" said he. "Yes, sire, I am not accustomed to take rest." "But you are ill; you must take care of yourself." "Your majesty spoke just now of a speech to be pronounced to morrow." His majesty made no reply. This unexpected stroke embarrassed him. Fouquet felt the weight of this hesitation. He thought he could read danger in the eyes of the young prince, which fear would but precipitate. "If I appear frightened, I am lost," thought he. The king, on his part, was only uneasy at the alarm of Fouquet. "Has he a suspicion of anything?" murmured he. "If his first word is severe," again thought Fouquet, "if he becomes angry, or feigns to be angry for the sake of a pretext, how shall I extricate myself? Let us smooth the declivity a little. Gourville was right." "Sire," said he, suddenly, "since the goodness of the king watches over my health to the point of dispensing with my labor, may I not be allowed to be absent from the council of tomorrow? I could pass the day in bed, and will entreat the king to grant me his physician, that we may endeavor to find a remedy against this fearful fever." "So be it, Monsieur Fouquet. It shall be as you desire. You shall have a holiday to morrow. You shall have the physician, and shall be restored to health."
"Thanks," said Fouquet, bowing.
Then opening his game,
"Shall I not have the happiness of conducting your majesty to my residence of Belle Isle?"
and he looked Louis full in the face, to judge of the effect of such a proposal. The king blushed again. "Do you know," replied he, endeavoring to smile, "that you have just said, 'my residence of Belle Isle'?"
"Yes, sire."
"Well, do you not remember," continued the king in the same cheerful tone, "that you gave me Belle Isle?"
"That is true again, sire; only, as you have not taken it, you will doubtless come with me and take possession of it."
"I mean to do so."
"That was, besides, your majesty's intention as well as mine, and I cannot express to your majesty how happy and proud I have been to see all the king's regiments from Paris to help take possession."
The king stammered out that he did not bring the musketeers for that alone.
"Oh, I am convinced of that," said Fouquet, warmly. "Your majesty knows very well that you have nothing to do but to come alone with a cane in your hand, to bring to the ground all the fortifications of Belle Isle."
"Peste!" cried the king. "I do not wish those fine fortifications, which cost so much to build, to fall at all. No, let them stand against the Dutch and English. You would not guess what I want to see at Belle Isle, Monsieur Fouquet. It is the pretty peasants and women of the lands on the seashore, who dance so well, and are so seducing with their scarlet petticoats. I have heard great boast of your pretty tenants, monsieur le surintendant. Well, let me have a sight of them."
"Whenever your majesty pleases."
"Have you any means of transport? It shall be tomorrow, if you like." The surintendant felt this stroke, which was not adroit, and replied,
"No, sire, I was ignorant of your majesty's wish. Above all, I was ignorant of your haste to see Belle Isle, and I am prepared with nothing."
"You have a boat of your own, nevertheless?"
"I have 5, but they are all in port, or at Paimboeuf, and to join them, or bring them hither, will require at least 24 hours. Have I any occasion to send a courier? Must I do so?"
"Wait a little, put an end to the fever. Wait till tomorrow."
"That is true. Who knows but by tomorrow we may not have 100 other ideas,"
replied Fouquet, now perfectly convinced and very pale. The king started, and stretched his hand out towards his little bell, but Fouquet prevented his ringing.
"Sire," said he, "I have an ague. I am trembling with cold. If I remain a moment longer, I shall most likely faint. I request your majesty's permission to go and fling myself beneath the bedclothes."
"Indeed, you are in a shiver. It is painful to behold. Come, Monsieur Fouquet, begone. I will send to inquire after you."
"Your majesty overwhelms me with kindness. In an hour I shall be better."
"I will call some one to reconduct you," said the king.
"As you please, sire. I would gladly take the arm of any one."
"Monsieur d'Artagnan!" cried the king, ringing his little bell.
"Oh, sire!"
interrupted Fouquet, laughing in such a manner as made the prince feel cold,
"would you give me the captain of your musketeers to take me to my lodgings? An equivocal honor that, sire. A simple footman, I beg."
"And why, Monsieur Fouquet? Monsieur d'Artagnan conducts me often, and extremely well."
"Yes, but when he conducts you, sire, it is to obey you, whilst me—"
"Go on."
"If I am obliged to return home supported by the leader of the musketeers, it would be everywhere said you had had me arrested."
"Arrested!" replied the king, who became paler than Fouquet himself. "Arrested! Oh!"
"And why should they not say so?" continued Fouquet, still laughing. "And I would lay a wager there would be people found wicked enough to laugh at it."
This sally disconcerted the monarch. Fouquet was skillful enough, or fortunate enough, to make Louis XIV. Recoil before the appearance of the deed he meditated. M. d'Artagnan, when he approached, received an order to desire a musketeer to accompany the surintendant.
"Quite unnecessary," said the latter. "Sword for sword, I prefer Gourville, who is waiting for me below. But that will not prevent me enjoying the society of M. d'Artagnan. I am glad he will see Belle Isle. He is so good a judge of fortifications."
D'Artagnan bowed, without at all comprehending what was going on. Fouquet bowed again, and left the apartment, affecting all the slowness of a man who walks with difficulty. When once out of the castle,
"I am saved," said he. "Oh, yes, disloyal king, you shall see Belle Isle, but it shall be when I am no longer there."
He disappeared, leaving D'Artagnan with the king. "Captain," said the king, "you will follow M. Fouquet at the distance of 100 paces." "Yes, sire." "He is going to his lodgings again; you will go with him." "Yes, sire." "You will arrest him in my name, and will shut him up in a carriage." "In a carriage. Well, sire?" "In such a fashion that he may not, on the road, either converse with any one, or throw notes to people he may meet." "That will be rather difficult, sire." "Not at all." "Pardon me, sire, I cannot stifle M. Fouquet, and if he asks for liberty to breathe, I cannot prevent him by closing both the windows and the blinds. He will throw out at the doors all the cries and notes possible." "The case is provided for, Monsieur d'Artagnan. A carriage with a trellis will obviate both the difficulties you point out." "A carriage with an iron trellis!" cried D'Artagnan. "But a carriage with an iron trellis is not made in half an hour, and your majesty commands me to go immediately to M. Fouquet's lodgings." "The carriage in question is already made." "Ah! that is quite a different thing," said the captain. "If the carriage is ready made, very well, then, we have only to set it in motion." "It is ready, and the horses harnessed." "Ah!" "And the coachman, with the outriders, is waiting in the lower court of the castle." D'Artagnan bowed. "There only remains for me to ask your majesty whither I shall conduct M. Fouquet." "To the castle of Angers, at first." "Very well, sire." "Afterwards, we will see." "Yes, sire." "Monsieur d'Artagnan, one last word. You have remarked that, for making this capture of M. Fouquet, I have not employed my guards, on which account M. de Gesvres will be furious." "Your majesty does not employ your guards," said the captain, a little humiliated, "because you mistrust M. de Gesvres, that is all." "That is to say, monsieur, that I have more confidence in you." "I know that very well, sire, and it is of no use to make so much of it." "It is only for the sake of arriving at this, monsieur, that if, from this moment, it should happen that by any chance whatever M. Fouquet should escape, such chances have been, monsieur." "Oh! very often, sire, but for others, not for me." "And why not with you?" "Because I, sire, have for an instant wished to save M. Fouquet." The king started. "Because," continued the captain, "I had then a right to do so, having guessed your majesty's plan, without you having spoken to me of it, and that I took an interest in M. Fouquet. Now, was I not at liberty to show my interest in this man?" "In truth, monsieur, you do not reassure me with regard to your services." "If I had saved him, then, I should have been perfectly innocent. I will say more, I should have done well, for M. Fouquet is not a bad man. But he was not willing, his destiny prevailed, he let the hour of liberty slip by. So much the worse. Now I have orders, I will obey those orders, and M. Fouquet you may consider as a man arrested. He is at the castle of Angers, this very M. Fouquet." "Oh, you have not got him yet, captain." "That concerns me. Every one to his trade, sire. Only, once more, reflect. Do you seriously give me orders to arrest Monsieur Fouquet, sire?" "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." "In writing, sire, then." "Here is the order." D'Artagnan read it, bowed to the king, and left the room. From the height of the terrace he perceived Gourville, who went by with a joyous air towards the lodgings of M. Fouquet. End of chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 40. The White Horse and the Black. "That is rather surprising," said D'Artagnan. "Gourville running about the streets so gaily when he is almost certain that M. Fouquet is in danger, when it is almost equally certain that it was Gourville who warned M. Fouquet just now by the note which was torn into 1,000 pieces upon the terrace, and given to the winds by monsieur le surintendant. Gourville is rubbing his hands. That is because he has done something clever. Whence comes Monsieur Gourville? Gourville is coming from the Rue aux Herbes. Whither does the Rue aux Herbes lead?" And D'Artagnan followed, along the tops of the houses of Nantes, dominated by the castle, the line traced by the streets, as he would have done upon a topographical plan, only, instead of the dead, flat paper, the living chart rose in relief with the cries, the movements, and the shadows of men and things. Beyond the enclosure of the city, the great verdant plains stretched out, bordering the Loire, and appeared to run towards the pink horizon, which was cut by the azure of the waters and the dark green of the marshes. Immediately outside the gates of Nantes, 2 white roads were seen diverging like separate fingers of a gigantic hand. D'Artagnan, who had taken in all the panorama at a glance by crossing the terrace, was led by the line of the Rue aux Herbes to the mouth of one of those roads which took its rise under the gates of Nantes. One step more, and he was about to descend the stairs, take his trellised carriage, and go towards the lodgings of M. Fouquet. But chance decreed, at the moment of plunging into the staircase, that he was attracted by a moving point then gaining ground upon that road. "What is that?" said the musketeer to himself. "A horse galloping. A runaway horse, no doubt. What a rate he is going at!" The moving point became detached from the road and entered into the fields. "A white horse," continued the captain, who had just observed the color thrown luminously against the dark ground. "And he is mounted. It must be some boy whose horse is thirsty and has run away with him." These reflections, rapid as lightning, simultaneous with visual perception, D'Artagnan had already forgotten when he descended the first steps of the staircase. Some morsels of paper were spread over the stairs, and shone out white against the dirty stones. "Eh! eh!" said the captain to himself, "here are some of the fragments of the note torn by M. Fouquet. Poor man! He has given his secret to the wind will have no more to do with it, and brings it back to the king. Decidedly, Fouquet, you play with misfortune. The game is not a fair one. Fortune is against you. The star of Louis XIV obscures yours. The adder is stronger and more cunning than the squirrel." D'Artagnan picked up one of the morsels of paper as he descended. "Gourville's pretty little hand!" cried he, whilst examining one of the fragments of the note. "I was not mistaken." And he read the word horse. "Stop!" said he, and he examined another, upon which there was not a letter traced. Upon a third he read the word white. "White horse," repeated he, like a child that is spelling. "Ah! Mordioux!" cried the suspicious spirit, "a white horse!" And, like that grain of powder which, burning, dilates into 10,000 times its volume, D'Artagnan, enlightened by ideas and suspicions, rapidly reascended the stairs towards the terrace. The white horse was still galloping in the direction of the Loire, at the extremity of which, melting into the vapors of the water, a little sail appeared, wave balanced like a water butterfly. "Oh!" cried the musketeer, Only a man who wants to fly would go at that pace across plowed lands. There is but one Fouquet, a financier, to ride thus in open day upon a white horse. There is no one but the Lord of Belle Isle who would make his escape towards the sea, while there are such thick forests on land, and there is but one D'Artagnan in the world to catch M. Fouquet, who has half an hour's start, and will have gained his boat within an hour." This being said, the musketeer gave orders that the carriage with the iron trellis should be taken immediately to a thicket situated just outside the city. He selected his best horse, jumped upon his back, galloped along the Rue aux Herbes, taking, not the road Fouquet had taken, but the bank itself of the Loire, certain that he should gain 10 minutes upon the total distance, and, at the intersection of the two lines, come up with the fugitive, who could have no suspicion of being pursued in that direction. In the rapidity of the pursuit, and with the impatience of the avenger, animating himself as in war, D'Artagnan, so mild, so kind towards Fouquet, was surprised to find himself become ferocious, almost sanguinary. For a long time he galloped without catching sight of the white horse. His rage assumed fury. He doubted himself. He suspected that Fouquet had buried himself in some subterranean road, or that he had changed the white horse for one of the famous black ones, as swift as the wind, which D'Artagnan, at Saint Mande, had so frequently admired and envied for their vigor and their fleetness. At such moments, when the wind cut his eyes so as to make the tears spring from them, when the saddle had become burning hot, when the galled and spurred horse reared with pain, and threw behind him a shower of dust and stones, D'Artagnan, raising himself in his stirrups, and seeing nothing on the waters, nothing beneath the trees, looked up into the air like a madman. He was losing his senses. In the paroxysms of eagerness he dreamt of aerial ways, the discovery of the following century. He called to his mind Daedalus and the vast wings that had saved him from the prisons of Crete. A hoarse sigh broke from his lips, as he repeated, devoured by the fear of ridicule, I, duped by a Gourville! I! They will say that I am growing old. They will say I have received 1,000,000 to allow Fouquet to escape." And he again dug his spurs into the sides of his horse. He had ridden astonishingly fast. Suddenly, at the extremity of some open pasture ground, behind the hedges, he saw a white form which showed itself, disappeared, and at last remained distinctly visible against the rising ground. D'Artagnan's heart leaped with joy. He wiped the streaming sweat from his brow, relaxed the tension of his knees, by which the horse breathed more freely, and gathering up his reins, moderated the speed of the vigorous animal, his active accomplice on this man hunt. He had then time to study the direction of the road, and his position with regard to Fouquet. The superintendent had completely winded his horse by crossing the soft ground. He felt the necessity of gaining a firmer footing, and turned towards the road by the shortest secant line. D'Artagnan, on his part, had nothing to do but to ride straight on, concealed by the sloping shore, so that he would cut his quarry off the road when he came up with him. Then the real race would begin. Then the struggle would be in earnest. D'Artagnan gave his horse good breathing time. He observed that the superintendent had relaxed into a trot, which was to say, he too was favoring his horse. But both of them were too much pressed for time to allow them to continue long at that pace. The white horse sprang off like an arrow the moment his feet touched firm ground. D'Artagnan dropped his head, and his black horse broke into a gallop. Both followed the same route. The quadruple echoes of this new race course were confounded. Fouquet had not yet perceived D'Artagnan, but on issuing from the slope, a single echo struck the air. It was that of the steps D'Artagnan's horse, which rolled along like thunder. Fouquet turned round and saw behind him, within 100 paces, his enemy bent over the neck of his horse. There could be no doubt. The shining baldric, the red cassock, it was a musketeer. Fouquet slackened his hand likewise, and the white horse placed 20 feet more between his adversary and himself. "Oh, but," thought D'Artagnan, becoming very anxious, "that is not a common horse Monsieur Fouquet is upon. Let us see." And he attentively examined with his infallible eye the shape and capabilities of the courser. Round, full quarters, a thin, long tail, large hocks, thin legs, as dry as bars of steel, hoofs hard as marble. He spurred his own, but the distance between the two remained the same. D'Artagnan listened attentively; not a breath of the horse reached him, and yet he seemed to cut the air. The black horse, on the contrary, began to puff like any blacksmith's bellows. "I must overtake him, if I kill my horse," thought the musketeer, and he began to saw the mouth of the poor animal, whilst he buried the rowels of his merciless spurs into his sides. The maddened horse gained 20 paces, and came up within pistol shot of Fouquet. "Courage!" said the musketeer to himself. "Courage! The white horse will perhaps grow weaker, and if the horse does not fall, the master must pull up at last." But horse and rider remained upright together, gaining ground by difficult degrees. D'Artagnan uttered a wild cry, which made Fouquet turn round, and added speed to the white horse.
"A famous horse, a mad rider!" growled the captain. "Hola! Mordioux! Monsieur Fouquet! Stop, in the king's name!" Fouquet made no reply. "Do you hear me?" shouted D'Artagnan, whose horse had just stumbled. "Pardieu!" replied Fouquet, laconically, and rode on faster. D'Artagnan was nearly mad; the blood rushed boiling to his temples and his eyes. "In the king's name!" cried he again, "stop, or I will bring you down with a pistol shot." "Do!" replied Fouquet, without relaxing his speed. D'Artagnan seized a pistol, and cocked it, hoping that the double click of the spring would stop his enemy. "You have pistols likewise," said he. "Turn and defend yourself." Fouquet did turn round at the noise, and looking D'Artagnan full in the face, opened, with his right hand, the part of his dress which concealed his body, but he did not even touch his holsters. There were not more than 20 paces between the two. "Mordioux!" said D'Artagnan, "I will not assassinate you. If you will not fire upon me, surrender. What is a prison?" "I would rather die," replied Fouquet. "I shall suffer less." D'Artagnan, drunk with despair, hurled his pistol to the ground. "I will take you alive," said he, and by a prodigy of skill which this incomparable horseman alone was capable, he threw his horse forward to within 10 paces of the white horse. Already his hand was stretched out to seize his prey. "Kill me! Kill me!" cried Fouquet. "'Twould be more humane." "No, alive, alive!" murmured the captain. At this moment his horse made a false step for the second time, and Fouquet's again took the lead. It was an unheard of spectacle, this race between two horses which now only kept alive by the will of their riders. It might be said that D'Artagnan rode, carrying his horse along between his knees. To the furious gallop had succeeded the fast trot, and that had sunk to what might be scarcely called a trot at all. But the chase appeared equally warm in the two fatigued athleteaux. D'Artagnan, quite in despair, seized his second pistol and cocked it. "At your horse, not at you!" cried he to Fouquet. And he fired. The animal was hit in the quarters. He made a furious bound, and plunged forward. At that moment D'Artagnan's horse fell dead. "I am dishonored," thought the musketeer. "I am a miserable wretch. For pity's sake, Monsieur Fouquet, throw me one of your pistols that I may blow out my brains." But Fouquet rode away. "For mercy's sake! For mercy's sake!" cried D'Artagnan. "That which you will not do at this moment I myself will do within an hour; but here upon this road I should die bravely, I should die esteemed. Do me that service, Monsieur Fouquet." Monsieur Fouquet made no reply, but continued to trot on. D'Artagnan began to run after his enemy. Successively he threw away his hat, his coat, which embarrassed him, and then the sheath of his sword, which got between his legs as he was running. The sword in his hand itself became too heavy, and he threw it after the sheath. The white horse began to rattle in its throat. D'Artagnan gained upon him.
From a trot, the exhausted animal sunk to a staggering walk. The foam from his mouth was mixed with blood. D'Artagnan made a desperate effort, sprang towards Fouquet, and seized him by the leg, saying in a broken, breathless voice, "I arrest you in the king's name. Blow my brains out if you like. We have both done our duty." Fouquet hurled far from him, into the river, the two pistols D'Artagnan might have seized, and, dismounting from his horse, "I am your prisoner, monsieur," said he. "Will you take my arm, for I see you are ready to faint?" "Thanks," murmured D'Artagnan, who in fact felt the earth sliding from under his feet, and the light of day turning to blackness around him. Then he rolled upon the sand, without breath or strength. Fouquet hastened to the brink of the river, dipped some water in his hat, with which he bathed the temples of the musketeer, and introduced a few drops between his lips. D'Artagnan raised himself with difficulty, and looked about him with a wandering eye. He beheld Fouquet on his knees, with his wet hat in his hand, smiling upon him with ineffable sweetness. "You are not off, then?" cried he. "Oh, monsieur! The true king of royalty, in heart, in soul, is not Louis of the Louvre, or Philippe of Sainte Marguerite. It is you, proscribed, condemned." "I, who this day am ruined by a single error, Monsieur d'Artagnan." "What, in the name of Heaven, is that?" "I should have had you for a friend. But how shall we return to Nantes? We are a great way from it." "That is true," said D'Artagnan, gloomily. "The white horse will recover, perhaps. He is a good horse. Mount, Monsieur d'Artagnan. I will walk till you have rested a little." "Poor beast! and wounded, too," said the musketeer. "He will go, I tell you. I know him. But we can do better still. Let us both get up and ride slowly." "We can try," said the captain. But they had scarcely charged the animal with this double load, when he began to stagger, and then with a great effort walked a few minutes, then staggered again, and sank down dead by the side of the black horse, which he had just managed to come up to. "We will go on foot. Destiny wills it so. The walk will be pleasant," said Fouquet, passing his arm through that of D'Artagnan. "Mordioux!" cried the latter, with a fixed eye, a contracted brow, and a swelling heart. "What a disgraceful day!" They walked slowly the 4 leagues which separated them from the little wood behind which the carriage and escort were in waiting. When Fouquet perceived that sinister machine, he said to D'Artagnan, who cast down his eyes, ashamed of Louis XIV., "There is an idea that did not emanate from a brave man, Captain D'Artagnan. It is not yours. What are these gratings for?" said he. "To prevent your throwing letters out." "Ingenious!" "But you can speak if you cannot write," said D'Artagnan. "Can I speak to you?" "Why, certainly, if you wish to do so." Fouquet reflected for a moment, then looking the captain full in the face, "One single word," said he. "Will you remember it?" "I will not forget it." "Will you speak it to whom I wish?" "I will." "Saint Mande," articulated Fouquet, in a low voice. "Well, and for whom?" "For Madame de Belliere or Pelisson." "It shall be done." The carriage rolled through Nantes, and took the route to Angers. Chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 41, in which the squirrel falls, the adder flies. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The king, full of impatience, went to his cabinet on the terrace, and kept opening the door of the corridor to see what his secretaries were doing. M. Colbert, seated in the same place M. de Saint Aignan had so long occupied in the morning, was chatting in a low voice with M. de Brienne. The king opened the door suddenly and addressed them. "What is it you are saying?" We were speaking of the first sitting of the States, said Monsieur de Brienne, rising. Very well, replied the king, and returned to his room. 5 minutes after, the summons of the bell recalled Rose, whose hour it was. Have you finished your copies? asked the king. Not yet, sire. See if Monsieur d'Artagnan has returned. Not yet, sire. It is very strange, murmured the king. Call Monsieur Colbert. Colbert entered. He had been expecting this all the morning. Monsieur Colbert, said the king very sharply, you must ascertain what has become of Monsieur d'Artagnan. Colbert, in his calm voice, replied, Where does your majesty desire him to be sought for? Eh, monsieur? Do you not know on what I have sent him? Replied Louis acrimoniously. Your majesty did not inform me. Monsieur, there are things that must be guessed, and you, above all, are apt to guess them. I might have been able to imagine, sire, but I do not presume to be positive. Colbert had not finished these words when a rougher voice than that of the king interrupted the interesting conversation thus begun between the monarch and his clerk. D'Artagnan! cried the king with evident joy. D'Artagnan, pale and in evidently bad humor, cried to the king as he entered, Sire, is it your majesty who has given orders to my musketeers? What orders? said the king. About Monsieur Fouquet's house? None, replied Louis. Ha! said D'Artagnan, biting his mustache. I was not mistaken then. It was Monsieur here, and he pointed to Colbert. What orders? Let me know, said the king. Orders to turn the house topsy-turvy, to beat Monsieur Fouquet's servants, to force the drawers, to give over a peaceful house to pillage. Mordioux, these are savage orders. Monsieur, said Colbert, turning pale. Monsieur, interrupted D'Artagnan, the king alone, understand, the king alone has a right to command my musketeers. But as to you, I forbid you to do it, and I tell you so before his majesty. Gentlemen who carry swords do not sling pins behind their ears. D'Artagnan, D'Artagnan, murmured the king. It is humiliating, continued the musketeer. My soldiers are disgraced. I do not command Raitre, thank you, nor clerks of the intendant, Mordioux. Well, but what is this all about? said the king with authority. About this, sire. Monsieur, who could not guess your majesty's orders, and consequently could not know I was gone to arrest Monsieur Fouquet. Monsieur, who has caused the iron cage to be constructed for his patron of yesterday, has sent Monsieur de Ronquerolles to the lodgings of Monsieur Fouquet, and, under the pretence of securing the surintendant's papers, they have taken away the furniture. My musketeers have been posted round the house all the morning. Such were my orders. Why did any one presume to order them to enter? Why, by forcing them to assist in this pillage, have they been made accomplices in it? Mordioux! We serve the king, we do, but we do not serve Monsieur Colbert. Footnote. Dumas here, and later in the chapter, uses the name Ronquerolles. Ronquerolles is the actual name of the man. End of footnote. Monsieur d'Artagnan, said the king sternly, take care. It is not in my presence that such explanations, and made in such a tone, should take place. I have acted for the good of the king, said Colbert in a faltering voice. It is hard to be so treated by one of your majesty's officers, and that without redress, on account of the respect I owe the king. The respect you owe the king, cried D'Artagnan, his eyes flashing fire, consists in the first place in making his authority respected and his person beloved. Every agent of a power without control represents that power, and when people curse the hand which strikes them, it is the royal hand that God reproaches. Do you hear? Must a soldier, hardened by 40 years of wounds and blood, give you this lesson, monsieur? Must mercy be on my side, and ferocity on yours? You have caused the innocent to be arrested, bound, and imprisoned." "Accomplices, perhaps, of M. Fouquet," said Colbert. "Who told you M. Fouquet had accomplices, or even that he was guilty? The king alone knows that. His justice is not blind. When he says, 'Arrest and imprison such and such a man,' he is obeyed. Do not talk to me, then, any more of the respect you owe the king, and be careful of your words, that they may not chance to convey the slightest menace, for the king will not allow those to be threatened who do him service by others who do him disservice. And if in case I should have, which God forbid, a master so ungrateful, I would make myself respected." Thus saying, D'Artagnan took his station haughtily in the king's cabinet, his eyes flashing, his hand on his sword, his lips trembling, affecting much more anger than he really felt. Colbert, humiliated and devoured with rage, bowed to the king as if to ask his permission to leave the room. The king, thwarted alike in pride and in curiosity, knew not which part to take. D'Artagnan saw him hesitate. To remain longer would have been a mistake. It was necessary to score a triumph over Colbert, and the only method was to touch the king so near the quick that his majesty would have no other means of extrication but choosing between the two antagonists. D'Artagnan bowed as Colbert had done. But the king, who in preference to everything else, was anxious to have all the exact details of the arrest of the surintendant of the finances from him who had made him tremble for a moment. The king, perceiving that the ill humor of D'Artagnan would put off for half an hour at least the details he was burning to be acquainted with, Louis, we say, forgot Colbert, who had nothing new to tell him, and recalled his captain of the musketeers. "In the first place," said he, "let me see the result of your commission, monsieur. You may rest yourself hereafter." D'Artagnan, who was just passing through the doorway, stopped at the voice of the king, retraced his steps, and Colbert was forced to leave the closet. His countenance assumed almost a purple hue, his black and threatening eyes shone with a dark fire beneath their thick brows. He stepped out, bowed before the king, half drew himself up in passing D'Artagnan, and went away with death in his heart. D'Artagnan, on being left alone with the king, softened immediately, and, composing his countenance, "Sire," said he, "you are a young king. It is by the dawn that people judge whether the day will be fine or dull. How, sire, will the people, whom the hand of God has placed under your law, argue of your reign, if between them and you allow angry and violent ministers to interpose their mischief? But let us speak of myself, sire. Let us leave a discussion that may appear idle, and perhaps inconvenient to you. Let us speak of myself. I have arrested M. Fouquet." "You took plenty of time about it," said the king, sharply. D'Artagnan looked at the king. "I perceive that I have expressed myself badly. I announced to your majesty that I had arrested M. Fouquet." "You did, and what then?" "Well, I ought to have told your majesty that M. Fouquet had arrested me. That would have been more just. I re established the truth, then. I have been arrested by M. Fouquet." It was now the turn of Louis XIV. To be surprised. His majesty was astonished in his turn. D'Artagnan, with his quick glance, appreciated what was passing in the heart of his master. He did not allow him time to put any questions. He related, with that poetry, that picturesqueness, which perhaps he alone possessed at that period, the escape of Fouquet, the pursuit, the furious race, and lastly, the inimitable generosity of the surintendant, who might have fled 10 times over,
who might have killed the adversary in the pursuit, but who had preferred imprisonment, perhaps worse, to the humiliation of one who wished to rob him of his liberty. In proportion as the tale advanced, the king became agitated, devouring the narrator's words, and drumming with his fingernails upon the table. It results from all this, sire, in my eyes at least, that the man who conducts himself thus is a gallant man, and cannot be an enemy to the king. That is my opinion, and I repeat it to your majesty. I know what the king will say to me, and I bow to it. Reasons of state. So be it. To my ears that sounds highly respectable. But I am a soldier, and I have received my orders. My orders are executed. Very unwillingly on my part, it is true, but they are executed. I say no more. "Where is Monsieur Fouquet at this moment?" asked Louis, after a short silence. "Monsieur Fouquet, sire," replied D'Artagnan, "is in the iron cage that M. Colbert had prepared for him, and is galloping as fast as 4 strong horses can drag him toward Angers." "Why did you leave him on the road?" "Because your majesty did not tell me to go to Angers. The proof, the best proof of what I advance, is that the king desired me to be sought for but this minute, and then I had another reason." "What is that?" "Whilst I was with him, poor M. Fouquet would never attempt to escape." "Well!" cried the king, astonished. "Your majesty ought to understand, and does understand, certainly, that my warmest wish is to know that M. Fouquet is at liberty. I have given him one of my brigadiers, the most stupid I could find among my musketeers, in order that the prisoner might have a chance of escaping." "Are you mad, Monsieur d'Artagnan?" cried the king, crossing his arms on his breast. "Do people utter such enormities, even when they have the misfortune to think them?" "Ah! sire, you cannot expect that I should be an enemy to M. Fouquet, after what he has just done for you and me. No, no; if you desire that he should remain under your lock and bolt, never give him in charge to me. However closely wired might be the cage, the bird would, in the end, take wing." "I am surprised," said the king, in his sternest tone, "you did not follow the fortunes of the man M. Fouquet wished to place upon my throne. You had in him all you want, affection, gratitude. In my service, monsieur, you will only find a master." "If M. Fouquet had not gone to seek you in the Bastile, sire," replied D'Artagnan, with a deeply impressive manner, "one single man would have gone there, and I should have been that man. You know that right well, sire." The king was brought to a pause. Before that speech of his captain of the musketeers, so frankly spoken and so true, the king had nothing to offer. On hearing D'Artagnan, Louis remembered the D'Artagnan of former times, him who, at the Palais Royal, held himself concealed behind the curtains of his bed, when the people of Paris, led by Cardinal de Retz, came to assure themselves of the presence of the king; the D'Artagnan whom he saluted with his hand at the door of his carriage, when repairing to Notre Dame on his return to Paris; the soldier who had quitted his service at Blois; the lieutenant he had recalled to be beside his person when the death of Mazarin restored his power; the man he had always found loyal, courageous, devoted. Louis advanced towards the door, and called Colbert. Colbert had not left the corridor where the secretaries were at work. He reappeared. "Colbert, did you make a perquisition on the house of M. Fouquet?" "Yes, sire." "What has it produced?" "M. de Ronquerolles, who was sent with your majesty's musketeers, has remitted me some papers," replied Colbert. "I will look at them. Give me your hand." "My hand, sire?" "Yes, that I may place it in that of M. d'Artagnan."
In fact, Monsieur d'Artagnan," added he, with a smile, turning towards the soldier, who, at sight of the clerk, had resumed his haughty attitude, "you do not know this man; make his acquaintance." And he pointed to Colbert. "He has been made but a moderately valuable servant in subaltern positions, but he will be a great man if I raise him to the foremost rank."
"Sire!"
stammered Colbert, confused with pleasure and fear. "I always understood why," murmured D'Artagnan in the king's ear, "he was jealous." "Precisely. And his jealousy confined his wings." "He will henceforward be a winged serpent," grumbled the musketeer, with a remnant of hatred against his recent adversary. But Colbert, approaching him, offered to his eyes a physiognomy so different from that which he had been accustomed to see him wear, he appeared so good, so mild, so easy, his eyes took the expression of an intelligence so noble, that D'Artagnan, a connoisseur in physiognomies, was moved, and almost changed in his convictions. Colbert pressed his hand.
"That which the king has just told you, monsieur, proves how well his majesty is acquainted with men. The inveterate opposition I have displayed, up to this day, against abuses and not against men, proves that I had it in view to prepare for my king a glorious reign, for my country a great blessing. I have many ideas, Monsieur d'Artagnan. You will see them expand in the sun of public peace, and if I have not the good fortune to conquer the friendship of honest men, I am at least certain, monsieur, that I shall obtain their esteem. For their admiration, monsieur, I would give my life."
This change, this sudden elevation, this mute approbation of the king, gave the musketeer matter for profound reflection. He bowed civilly to Colbert, who did not take his eyes off him. The king, when he saw that they were reconciled, dismissed them. They left the room together. As soon as they were out of the cabinet, the new minister, stopping the captain, said,
"Is it possible, Monsieur d'Artagnan, that with such an eye as yours, you did not, at the first glance, at the first impression, discover what sort of man I am?"
"Monsieur Colbert," replied the musketeer, "a ray of the sun in our eyes prevents us from seeing the most vivid flame. The man in power radiates, you know; and since you are there, why should you continue to persecute him who had just fallen into disgrace, and fallen from such a height?"
"I, monsieur," said Colbert, "oh, monsieur, I would never persecute him. I wish to administer the finances, and to administer them alone, because I am ambitious, and, above all, because I have the most entire confidence in my own merit, because I know that all the gold of this country will ebb and flow beneath my eyes, and I love to look at the king's gold, because, if I live 30 years, in 30 years not a denier of it will remain in my hands, because, with that gold, I will build granaries, castles, cities, and harbors, because I will create a marine, I will equip navies that shall waft the name of France to the most distant people, because I will create libraries and academies, because I will make France the first country in the world, and the wealthiest. These are the motives for my animosity against M. Fouquet, who prevented my acting. And then, when I shall be great and strong, when France is great and strong, in my turn then will I cry, 'Mercy!'"
"Mercy, did you say? Then ask his liberty of the king. The king is only crushing him on your account." Colbert again raised his head.
"Monsieur," said he, "you know that is not so, and that the king has his own personal animosity against M. Fouquet. It is not for me to teach you that."
"But the king will grow tired, he will forget."
The king never forgets, Monsieur d'Artagnan. Hark! The king calls. He is going to issue an order. I have not influenced him, have I? Listen." The king, in fact, was calling his secretaries. "Monsieur d'Artagnan," said he. "I am here, sire." "Give 20 of your musketeers to M. de Saint Aignan, to form a guard for M. Fouquet." D'Artagnan and Colbert exchanged looks. "And from Angers," continued the king, "they will conduct the prisoner to the Bastile, in Paris." "You were right," said the captain to the minister. "Saint Aignan," continued the king, "you will have any one shot who shall attempt to speak privately with M. Fouquet during the journey." "But myself, sire?" said the duke. "You, monsieur, you will only speak to him in the presence of the musketeers." The duke bowed, and departed to execute his commission. D'Artagnan was about to retire likewise, but the king stopped him. "Monsieur," said he, "you will go immediately and take possession of the Ile and fief of Belle Ile en Mer." "Yes, sire. Alone?" "You will take a sufficient number of troops to prevent delay, in case the place should be contumacious." A murmur of courtly incredulity arose from the group of courtiers. "That shall be done," said D'Artagnan. "I saw the place in my infancy," resumed the king, "and I do not wish to see it again. You have heard me? Go, monsieur, and do not return without the keys." Colbert went up to D'Artagnan. "A commission which, if you carry it out well," said he, "will be worth a marechal's baton to you." "Why do you employ the words, 'if you carry it out well'?" "Because it is difficult." "Ah! In what respect?" "You have friends in Belle Isle, Monsieur d'Artagnan, and it is not an easy thing for men like you to march over the bodies of their friends to obtain success." D'Artagnan hung his head in deepest thought, whilst Colbert returned to the king. A quarter of an hour after, the captain received the written order from the king to blow up the fortress of Belle Isle, in case of resistance, with power of life and death over all the inhabitants or refugees, and an injunction not to allow one to escape. Colbert was right, thought D'Artagnan. For me, the baton of a marechal of France will cost the lives of my two friends. Only they seem to forget that my friends are not more stupid than the birds, and that they will not wait for the hand of the fowler to extend over their wings. I will show them that hand so plainly that they will have quite time enough to see it. Poor Porthos! Poor Aramis! No, my fortune should and shall not cost your wings a feather. Having thus determined, D'Artagnan assembled the royal army, embarked it at Paimboeuf, and set sail, without the loss of an unnecessary minute. End of chapter. The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 42. Belle Ile en Mer. At the extremity of the mole, against which the furious sea beats at the evening tide, two men, holding each other by the arm, were conversing in an animated and expansive tone, without the possibility of any other human being hearing their words, borne away as they were, one, by the gusts of wind, with the white foam swept from the crests of the waves. The sun had just gone down in the vast sheet of the crimsoned ocean, like a gigantic crucible. From time to time, one of these men, turning towards the east, cast an anxious, inquiring look over the sea. The other, interrogating the features of his companion, seemed to seek for information in his looks. Then, both silent, busied with dismal thoughts, they resumed their walk. Every one has already perceived that these two men were our proscribed heroes, Porthos and Aramis, who had taken refuge in Belle Isle, since the ruin of their hopes, since the discomfiture of the colossal schemes of M. d'Herblay.
It is of no use your saying anything to the contrary, my dear Aramis, repeated Porthos, inhaling vigorously the salt breeze with which he charged his massive chest. It is of no use, Aramis. The disappearance of all the fishing boats that went out 2 days ago is not an ordinary circumstance. There has been no storm at sea. The weather has been constantly calm, not even the lightest gale. And even if we had had a tempest, all our boats would not have foundered. I repeat, it is strange. This complete disappearance astonishes me, I tell you. True, murmured Aramis. You are right, friend Porthos. It is true. There is something strange in it. And further, added Porthos, whose ideas the ascent of the Bishop of Vannes seemed to enlarge, and further, do you not observe that if the boats have perished, not a single plank is washed ashore? I have remarked it as well as yourself. And do you not think it strange that the only 2 boats we had left in the whole island, and which I sent in search of the others— Aramis here interrupted his companion by a cry, and by so sudden a movement that Porthos stopped as if he were stupefied. What do you say, Porthos? What? You have sent the 2 boats? In search of the others. Yes, to be sure I have, replied Porthos, calmly. Unhappy man, what have you done? Then we are indeed lost, cried the bishop. Lost? What did you say? Exclaimed the terrified Porthos. How lost, Aramis? How are we lost? Aramis bit his lips. Nothing, nothing. Your pardon, I meant to say— What? That if we were inclined, if we took a fancy to make an excursion by sea, we could not. Very good, and why should that vex you? A precious pleasure, ma foi! For my part, I don't regret it at all. What I regret is certainly not the more or less amusement we can find at Belle Isle. What I regret, Aramis, is Pierrefonds, Bracieux, Le Vallon, beautiful France. Here we are not in France, my dear friend. We are, I know not where. Oh, I tell you, in full sincerity of soul, and your affection will excuse my frankness, but I declare to you I am not happy at Belle Isle. No, in good truth, I am not happy. Aramis breathed a long but stifled sigh. Dear friend, replied he, that is why it is so sad a thing you have sent the 2 boats we had left in search of the boats which disappeared 2 days ago. If you had not sent them away, we would have departed. Departed? And the orders, Aramis? What orders? Parbleu! Why, the orders you have been constantly, in and out of season, repeating to me, that we were to hold Belle Isle against the usurper. You know very well. That is true, murmured Aramis again. You see, then, plainly, my friend, that we could not depart, and that the sending away of the boats in search of the others cannot prove prejudicial to us in the very least. Aramis was silent, and his vague glances, luminous as that of an albatross, hovered for a long time over the sea, interrogating space, seeking to pierce the very horizon. With all that, Aramis, continued Porthos, who adhered to his idea, and that the more closely from the bishop having apparently endorsed it, with all that, you give me no explanation about what can have happened to these unfortunate boats. I am assailed by cries and complaints whichever way I go. The children cry to see the desolation of the women, as if I could restore the absent husbands and fathers. What do you suppose, my friend, and how ought I to answer them? Think all you like, my good Porthos, and say nothing. This reply did not satisfy Porthos at all. He turned away grumbling something in ill humor. Aramis stopped the valiant musketeer. Do you remember, said he in a melancholy tone, kneading the 2 hands of the giant between his own with affectionate cordiality, Do you remember, my friend, that in the glorious days of youth, do you remember, Porthos, when we were all strong and valiant, we and the other two, if we had then had an inclination to return to France, do you think this sheet of salt water would have stopped us?" "Oh," said Porthos, "but 6 leagues!" "If you had seen me get astride of a plank, would you have remained on land, Porthos?" "No, pardieu! No, Aramis. But nowadays, what sort of a plank should we want, my friend? I in particular." And the Seigneur de Bracieux cast a profound glance over his colossal rotundity with a loud laugh. "And do you mean seriously to say you are not tired of Belle Isle a little, and that you would not prefer the comforts of your dwelling, of your episcopal palace at Vannes? Come, confess." "No," replied Aramis, without daring to look at Porthos. "Let us stay where we are, then," said his friend, with a sigh, which, in spite of the efforts he made to restrain it, escaped his echoing breast. "Let us remain, let us remain. And yet," added he, "and yet, if we seriously wished, but that decidedly, if we had a fixed idea, one firmly taken, to return to France, and there were not boats—" "Have you remarked another thing, my friend? That is, since the disappearance of our barks, during the last 2 days' absence of fishermen, not a single small boat has landed on the shores of the isle?" "Yes, certainly, you are right. I, too, have remarked it, and the observation was the more naturally made, for, before the last 2 fatal days, barks and shallops were as plentiful as shrimps." "I must inquire," said Aramis, suddenly and with great agitation. "And then, if we had a raft constructed—" "But there are some canoes, my friend. Shall I board one?" "A canoe! A canoe! Can you think of such a thing, Porthos? A canoe to be upset in? No, no," said the bishop of Vannes. "It is not our trade to ride upon the waves. We will wait, we will wait." And Aramis continued walking about with increased agitation. Porthos, who grew tired of following all the feverish movements of his friend, Porthos, who in his faith and calmness understood nothing of the sort of exasperation which was betrayed by his companion's continual convulsive starts, Porthos stopped him. "Let us sit down upon this rock," said he. "Place yourself there, close to me, Aramis, and I conjure you, for the last time, to explain to me in a manner I can comprehend, explain to me what we are doing here." "Porthos," said Aramis, much embarrassed. "I know that the false king wished to dethrone the true king. That is a fact that I understand. Well—" "Yes," said Aramis. "I know that the false king formed the project of selling Belle Isle to the English. I understand that too." "Yes." "I know that we engineers and captains came and threw ourselves into Belle Isle to take direction of the works, and the command of 10 companies levied and paid by M. Fouquet, or rather, the 10 companies of his son in law. All that is plain." Aramis rose in a state of great impatience. He might be said to be a lion importuned by a gnat. Porthos held him by the arm. "But what I cannot understand, what, in spite of all the efforts of my mind, and all my reflections, I cannot comprehend, and never shall comprehend, is, that instead of sending us troops, instead of sending us reinforcements of men, munitions, provisions, they leave us without boats, they leave Belle Isle without arrivals, without help. It is that instead of establishing with us a correspondence, whether by signals, or written or verbal communications, all relations with the shore are intercepted. Tell me, Aramis, answer me, or rather, before answering me, will you allow me to tell you what I have thought? Will you hear what my idea is, the plan I have conceived?" The bishop raised his head. Well, Aramis," continued Porthos, "I have dreamed, I have imagined that an event has taken place in France. I dreamt of M. Fouquet all the night, of lifeless fish, of broken eggs, of chambers badly furnished, meanly kept. Villainous dreams, my dear D'Herblay, very unlucky such dreams." "Porthos, what is that yonder?" interrupted Aramis, rising suddenly, and pointing out to his friend a black spot upon the empurpled line of the water. "A bark," said Porthos. "Yes, it is a bark. Ah, we shall have some news at last." "There are two," cried the bishop, on discovering another mast. "Two, three, four." "Five," said Porthos in his turn. "Six, seven. Ah, mon Dieu, mon Dieu! It is a fleet." "Our boats returning, probably," said Aramis very uneasily, in spite of the assurance he affected. "They are very large for fishing boats," observed Porthos. "And do you not remark, my friend, that they come from the Loire?" "They come from the Loire, yes." "And look, everybody here sees them as well as ourselves. Look, women and children are beginning to crowd the jetty." An old fisherman passed. "Are those our barks yonder?" asked Aramis. The old man looked steadily into the eye of the horizon. "No, monseigneur," replied he, "they are lighter boars. Boats in the king's service." "Boats in the royal service!" replied Aramis, starting. "How do you know that?" said he. "By the flag." "But," said Porthos, "the boat is scarcely visible. How the devil, my friend, can you distinguish the flag?" "I see there is one," replied the old man. "Our boats, trade lighters, do not carry any. That sort of craft is generally used for transport of troops." "Ah!" groaned Aramis. "Vivat!" cried Porthos. "They are sending us reinforcements, don't you think they are, Aramis?" "Probably." "Unless it is the English coming." "By the Loire. That would have an evil look, Porthos, for they must have come through Paris." "You are right. They are reinforcements, decidedly, or provisions." Aramis leaned his head upon his hands and made no reply. Then all at once, "Porthos," said he, "have the alarm sounded." "The alarm! Do you imagine such a thing?" "Yes, and let the cannoneers mount their batteries, the artillerymen be at their pieces, and be particularly watchful of the coast batteries." Porthos opened his eyes to their widest extent. He looked attentively at his friend, to convince himself he was in his proper senses. "I will do it, my dear Porthos," continuing Aramis in his blandest tone. "I will go and have these orders executed myself, if you do not go, my friend." "Well, I will, instantly," said Porthos, who went to execute the orders, casting all the while looks behind him, to see if the bishop of Vannes were not deceived, and if, on recovering more rational ideas, he would not recall him. The alarm was sounded, trumpets brayed, drums rolled, the great bronze bell swung in horror from its lofty belfry. The dikes and moles were quickly filled with the curious and soldiers, matches sparkled in the hands of the artillerymen, placed behind the large cannon bedded in their stone carriages. When every man was at his post, when all the preparations for defense were made, "Permit me, Aramis, to try to comprehend," whispered Porthos timidly in Aramis's ear. "My dear friend, you will comprehend but too soon," murmured M. d'Herblay, in reply to this question of his lieutenant. "The fleet which is coming yonder, with sails unfurled, straight towards the port of Belle Isle, is a royal fleet, is it not?" "But as there are two kings in France, Porthos, to which of these two kings does this fleet belong?" "Oh! you open my eyes!"
replied the giant, stunned by the insinuation. And Porthos, whose eyes this reply of his friend's had at last opened, or rather thickened the bandage which covered his sight, went with his best speed to the batteries to overlook his people, and exhort every one to do his duty. In the meantime, Aramis, with his eye fixed on the horizon, saw the ships continually drawing nearer. The people and the soldiers, perched on the summits of the rocks, could distinguish the masts, then the lower sails, and at last the hulls of the lighters, bearing at the masthead the royal flag of France. It was night when one of these vessels, which had created such a sensation among the inhabitants of Belle Isle, dropped anchor within cannon shot of the place. It was soon seen, notwithstanding the darkness, that some sort of agitation reigned on board the vessel, from the side of which a skiff was lowered, of which the three rowers, bending to their oars, took the direction of the port, and in a few instants struck land at the foot of the fort. The commander jumped ashore. He had a letter in his hand, which he waved in the air, and seemed to wish to communicate with somebody. This man was soon recognized by several soldiers as one of the pilots of the island. He was the captain of one of the two barks retained by Aramis, but which Porthos, in his anxiety with regard to the fate of the fishermen who had disappeared, had sent in search of the missing boats. He asked to be conducted to Monsieur d'Herblay. Two soldiers, at a signal from a sergeant, marched him between them and escorted him. Aramis was upon the quay. The envoy presented himself before the Bishop of Vannes. The darkness was almost absolute, notwithstanding the flambeaux borne at a small distance by the soldiers who were following Aramis in his rounds. "Well, Jonathan, from whom do you come?" "Monseigneur, from those who captured me." "Who captured you?" "You know, monseigneur, we set out in search of our comrades?" "Yes, and afterwards?" "Well, monseigneur, within a short league we were captured by a chasse maree belonging to the king." "Ah!" said Aramis. "Of which king?" cried Porthos. Jonathan started. "Speak," continued the bishop. "We were captured, monseigneur, and joined to those who had been taken yesterday morning." "What was the cause of the mania for capturing you all?" said Porthos. "Monsieur, to prevent us from telling you," replied Jonathan. Porthos was again at a loss to comprehend. "And they have released you today?" asked he. "That I might tell you that they captured us, monsieur." "Trouble upon trouble," thought honest Porthos. During this time Aramis was reflecting. "Humph!" said he. "Then I suppose it is a royal fleet blockading the coasts?" "Yes, monseigneur." "Who commands it?" "The captain of the king's musketeers." "D'Artagnan?" "D'Artagnan!" exclaimed Porthos. "I believe that is the name." "And did he give you this letter?" "Yes, monseigneur." "Bring the torches nearer." "It is his writing," said Porthos. Aramis eagerly read the following lines: "Order of the king to take Belle Isle, or to put the garrison to the sword if they resist. Order to make prisoners of all the men of the garrison. Signed, D'Artagnan, who the day before yesterday arrested Monsieur Fouquet for the purpose of his being sent to the Bastille." Aramis turned pale, and crushed the paper in his hands. "What is it?" asked Porthos. "Nothing, my friend, nothing." "Tell me, Jonathan." "Monseigneur?" "Did you speak to Monsieur d'Artagnan?" "Yes, monseigneur." "What did he say to you?" "That for ampler information he would speak with monseigneur." "Where?" "On board his own vessel." "On board his vessel?" And Porthos repeated, "On board his vessel." "Monsieur le mousquetaire," continued Jonathan,
told me to take you both on board my canoe and bring you to him."
"Let us go at once!" exclaimed Porthos. "Dear D'Artagnan!" But Aramis stopped him. "Are you mad?" cried he. "Who knows that it is not a snare?" "Of the other kings?" said Porthos, mysteriously. "A snare, in fact. That's what it is, my friend." "Very possibly. What is to be done, then, if D'Artagnan sends for us?" "Who assures you that D'Artagnan sends for us?" "Well, but his writing—" "Writing is easily counterfeited. This looks counterfeited, unsteady." "You are always right. But in the meantime we know nothing." Aramis was silent. "It is true," said the good Porthos. "We do not want to know anything." "What shall I do?" asked Jonathan. "You will return on board this captain's vessel." "Yes, monseigneur." "And will tell him that we beg he will himself come into the island." "Ah! I comprehend," said Porthos. "Yes, monseigneur," replied Jonathan. "But if the captain should refuse to come to Belle Isle?" "If he refuses, as we have cannon, we will make use of them." "What! Against D'Artagnan?" "If it is D'Artagnan, Porthos, he will come. Go, Jonathan, go." "Ma foi! I no longer comprehend anything," murmured Porthos. "I will make you comprehend it all, my dear friend. The time for it has come. Sit down upon this gun carriage, open your ears, and listen well to me." "Oh, pardieu! I will listen, no fear of that." "May I depart, monseigneur?" cried Jonathan. "Yes, begone, and bring back an answer. Allow the canoe to pass, you men there." And the canoe pushed off to regain the fleet. Aramis took Porthos by the hand, and commenced his explanations. End of chapter.